Contrary to mainstream belief, Carl Jung didn't invent the concept of synchronicity. Synchronicity, for those who aren't aware, is a perceived symmetry between a cosmic and domestic phenomenon. Whether or not you believe in such things, I'm sure I needn't convince you that the universe does indeed have a sense of humor, even if many of the jokes don't land or go right over our heads. Full disclosure, I don't believe in miracles or divine intervention, but I do believe in serendipity. Now, I've already done a whole other video on my theory regarding the origins of the aptly named woke mind virus, in which I've laid out my own personal journey and observations regarding the cyclical tides and intersections of pop culture and politics, which incidentally also lends more credence to my theory of everything, which I know I really need to come up with a better name for. So I won't waste too much time or space rehashing that whole episode, though I will obviously link it in the description for those who are curious. My point for right here, right now, is that I've watched as a gang of bright, disillusioned young rebels obtained never-before-seen powers to overthrow a corrupt and evil old hegemonic order, only for the true evil mastermind behind the face of the disasters which they'd understandably, though wrongly, laid solely at the old order's feet to merely change its shape, to beguile them in the form of a wise teacher, to then warp their genuine enthusiasm for progress and hatred of the old system's rancid greed and flagrant hypocrisy into a Faustian suicide pact which sought to sacrifice the whole world on a utopian altar in the name of their own nihilistic despair. In a word, in attempting to find their way towards the light from out of the bowels of the cave, this generation inadvertently became the false god's dark apprentice, and as such worked to further sow and tend its evil mania's seeds rather than stamp it out. But then, at the 11th hour, a few of them get wise to what they've helped produce, and after a ravaging 4-year war, wage a titanic battle to reclaim what was lost with the help of the false god's own rogue machines. The reason I call this all serendipitous is because what I've just described is actually the plot of my Flint Pirate Academy novel series. Though this was completely unintentional, I can assure you, in retrospect, given how closely I followed the real-world cultural and political scenes, it was not only entirely predictable, but wholly inevitable. And now, in the wake of the 2024 election, a full decade after my own great work's genesis, I finally have all the pieces I need to finish my puzzle. So with that as my lead-up, let me now get to the real point of this video. You see, I've mentioned before that the most persistent difficulty in marketing my magnum opus, apart from surmounting the whole furry fantasy stigma, has been coming up with a description that didn't involve dumping my whole life story and philosophy on people, both of which are integral to the plot, as I have been, figuratively speaking, in each and every one of the characters' skin at some point or another, albeit very briefly in some cases. But rather than waste more of your time, I'll just let my past self from the prelude to Book 4, The War of the Nine, finish this out for me. As always, all relevant links are in the description. And until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and stay vigilant. Peace. In certain far-flung reaches of the universe, there exist certain species who would consider it wholly unusual to live on a world that wasn't wholly subject to the universe's 4 cardinal permissions. For them, a planet was a solid ball in space, usually covered by a fair amount of either liquid water or ammonia, depending on what the elemental basis for life there was. Regardless of their material differences, however, it was still a universal facet of sentience to have wants that far outstripped any possible realistic capacity for product. Thus, it was left to them all individually to grapple with the task of trying to fit their infinite square peg of desire into the proverbial round hole of their finite world with finite resources. And so it still proved inextricable to their natures to resort to violent conflict whenever 2 or more of them couldn't have what they both wanted at the same time. Even with all that being equal to the multiplicitous species who called the wholly abnormal planet of even their home, these otherwise analogous aliens would still have probably found the concept of platform exchange warfare rather novel, if not downright absurd. This was because on a world where most of the life capable of conducting organized warfare initially spawned and, on the whole, tended to henceforth remain firmly anchored to the ground, there naturally tended to evolve a pronounced preoccupation with accumulating and keeping as much of the ground under one's control as possible. By contrast, on a world where most of the surface either didn't exist, though what little did was all the more savagely and bitterly contested, or was comprised of superdense, superheated plasma. The concept of aerodynamics not only took over a greater preponderance of attention in war times, but also held a great deal more sway over the popular imagination under most any circumstances where survival was not under immediate peril. Hence the adoption of such widespread phrasal denominators as under the foam or an amber well. Both of these expressions were in reference to the superordinate mass of roiling grayish foam known as the abyss, whose arcanovoltaic mass made up the vast supermajority of Even's planetary mass, over and under and about which most major wars of the last 3 millennia had been waged to a greater or lesser degree. That being said, every so often, a statistically significant percentage of the planet's scarce solid mineral materia amalgamated into greater chunks of semi-orbital stability, whose inhabitants this turnaround had chosen to call continents. It had naturally been postulated, and by some on the fringes of modern academia still ardently maintained, that as all things must have a cause, and that since the fractally nested complexity of their world otherwise evidenced multiple concurrent first causes, and that the probability of such perfectly orchestrated events naturally coming about through effectively random coincidence stood about as close to impossible as any idea expressible in numbered terms could be, they reasoned that there must have once been a time when their world had not been so divided, that it had once been whole and subsequently broken by manner or methods unknown in accordance with the then widely known and nigh universally accepted Emerald Theorem, which stated quite simply and eloquently, all is one. Given the ubiquitousness of the above wisdom and the intuitive genius of the claims, these and similarly cardio-charted arguments had gone effectively unchallenged for tens of centuries. Thus emboldened, these same radical minds had gone on to theorize that the planet had once been a solid, or at least mostly solid sphere, just like all the other celestial bodies astronomers had recorded throughout the eras. But as was the inevitable wont on a world with the obnoxious tendency to utterly physically reinvent itself every couple of eons, such befuddling mysteries remained barred from modern scholars and arcanists alike behind 7 impenetrable gates of apocalyptic entropy, known appropriately enough in those same circles as the divides. However, what still consistently got a nod from all heads was that, at some point between those mysterious before times, sentient life had emerged on these few stable blocks, and that the inherent incontinence of their situation, combined with the intrinsically magical nature of the abyss's matter, and the intuitive learning of what would come to be called the mystic arts by key individuals, and eventually entire groups, had rapidly led to earlier species developing robust, sustainable flight technology, which would shortly serve not only to save an appreciable fraction of these younger races from the subsequent divides, but would go on to become the foundation for a world of commerce and enlightenment unprecedented since the first, so-called Great Divide. That such factors had led to wars being fought not mainly on the land, which was far too precious and rare to risk damaging or worse destabilizing by constantly blasting it, but in the high clouds and in the low penumbra of the ionic clouds, collectively referred to by the world's warring populations as the abyss, should have seemed as entirely sensible as the advent of snowfall in winter. For those sectors of the sentient races not quite so predisposed to violence as their forebears, but also not so naive as to think that ink and treasure made up some magical salve for every ill besetting the world, the abyss had been summarily charted, plotted, and subdivided along militarily enforceable boundaries. These 9 sectors, or depths, as future generations would come to call them, would naturally just so happen to correlate perfectly with the outer reaches of the most powerfully armed factions of the time. The size and wealth of each charted abyssal blot also, of course, neatly corresponded to the proportional strength of its occupier. This absolute relationship between size, strength, and prosperity was so intuitively ingrained, so painfully obvious, that it didn't even warrant a mention when the Pax Ultima came up in more modern history courses, sometimes abbreviated to the 9 by bureaucrats whose infinitely petulant denotations were rivaled in their extreme absurdity only by the lengths those same social parasites would go to justify, and just as often sanctify, their own gerrymandered spot on the food chain. The abyssal territories proved just as much a bountiful and lucrative font of raw material resources as the lands they delineated. Elements like the raw magnolsus crystals, sundust, that powered everything from engines to streetlights, and the energetic yet paradoxically stable heavy water, aka quicksilver, which was not only prized among alchemists for use as a cold catalytic base, but by nearly every form of artisan from metallurgists to doctors for its sterility and omniversal amenability. Nothing short of miracles started happening on all fronts as material barriers begun slowly phasing into obsolescence, a process that was only accelerated by the alkaline substances of war, plague, famine, pestilence, and rot of every assorted bandwidth bequeathed upon the living condition. And naturally, at no point during all of this did any beast pause to consider the irony in the fact that the basis for all their worldly fortunes was the elementally passive byproduct harvested from the still fiery aftermath of an explosive reaction. But of course, where there was wealth to be had, even if it was already had by someone else, there would always be predators willing to risk life and limb to try and take it for their own. Of course, there would also always be those willing to risk others' lives and limbs as well, but that's a whole other tale in its own right. It is perhaps fitting that the word for these ruthless, marauding sociopaths, as most of the then civilized populace blanketly thought of them, was one of the oldest known words of modern Adamic to be given its current form: pirates. Originating through the Low Gothic word pirata from the Third Era felinist term pirates, both commonly meaning attacker, or more accurately, an attempted attacker, an ambush predator, an opportunistic hunter. The later equestrians would incorporate the sailing aspect during the last century or so of their rule before the Fifth Divide shattered their once great empire, ironically handing over its remains to the so-called barbarians, or free beasts, as they had thought of themselves. As it is common knowledge that the animal population of any given ecosystem will be approximately 1 part predator to every 9 parts prey species, it should be understood as only natural that the common view, and hence the common vernacular, would come to regard those who openly display predatory behavior as evil. Traits such as unprovoked aggression, exploiting the vulnerable, and generally wreaking and/or exploiting havoc and tragedy for personal gain all became synonymous with the worst kinds of malevolence, eventually gaining Adamic the word demon, derived from a combination of the Third Era Quetzal word, draken, meaning dragon, and a frankly embarrassingly stark atomization of the Old Menton word for serpent, jorman. It also should be mentioned that the association with dragons, themselves widely viewed as the ultimate predators, in this context also keeps strongly to the pre-established narrative path. Roughly 3 standard generations before the outset of the brutal intercontinental conflict that future generations would know as the War of the Nine, a single pirate captain, the single most successful in history insofar as financial gain went, had come upon an inclination to change the nature of piracy, capitalizing it, as he'd once said during a lengthy drunken tirade with his soon-to-be understudy and eventual successor, Avlin, a place of refuge, ostensibly, a formal sanctuary for the world's abandoned, wayward, or just listless free radicals to study and to become more than the wanton chattel a pitiless world would have otherwise made of them. A place where these despondent youths could remake themselves, could learn what it truly was to be free, but more, to learn the true ways of the world in a way that a single failure wouldn't necessarily equate to instant death. In Flint's own bold words, life tests, I teach. What they did with those tools, according to Flint and later by Avlon, and less so much farther down the line by Prockford, was their prerogative and their business alone, as were the consequences.
Greetings, Steve the Skull here. You'll have noticed that seemed to cut out abrupt. That's because Wolf didn't realize how long his prologue was, as you've no doubt noticed. He tends to ramble on if I'm not there to pull his whiskers. Anyway, we wanted to keep this to the minimal necessary for informational purposes, and we hope that you can forgive this slight glitch in performative quality. Many apologies, thanks, and have a good rest of your day. Farewell.